We are being now joined by Peter Kuznick from Washington, a professor of history and director of nuclear studies at American University. Welcome to the broadcast, Mr. Kuznick.
Glad to join you.
I will begin my first question with the outcome of the Cairo summit, which happened yesterday, where there was no agreement and no consensus towards containing the violence. What are your comments on this?
Well, there was a consensus that the humanitarian crisis has got to be eased, and a general understanding that if Israel does start a ground invasion, what we see now is a humanitarian crisis already is going to become 100 times worse. So they all want to restore the aid, humanitarian aid. That's an important first step. But the pressure has got to be put on Israel for an immediate ceasefire. If there is an invasion, it is not only going to kill thousands and thousands of Gazan civilians, it's going to kill a large number of Israeli soldiers, and it's going to raise the possibility of a broader war. What is Hezbollah going to do when they see the Palestinians being slaughtered en masse? Hamas is a relatively weak military force. Hezbollah is not. Hezbollah is a powerful one. They've got probably 100,000 troops and 150,000 rockets and missiles that they can launch at Israel. Many of them will be hitting Israeli cities. And then from there, the possibility of expanding to Iran, to Syria, to Iraq, to Yemen is really vast. So we're on the verge not only of a humanitarian catastrophe, but a global military catastrophe.
As you pointed out, I wanted to come to this point where this could possibly turn into a spillover, considering the continuing rising tensions between the Israel-Lebanon border. Now, I would also like to talk further about what happened yesterday at the Cairo summit, where, the Arab leaders condemned very clearly the bombardment of Gaza by Israel. On the other hand, the European leaders brought to the fore protection of civilians, taking a rather modest stand. Now, you see a sense of, you sense a bit of a gap in the overarching concerns here that were put forth by Arab leaders on one hand and the European leaders on the other. What is your assessment of this?
The Arab leaders are responding in large part to what's going on the Arab street. The populations throughout the Arab nations are enraged and inflamed and protesting and in the streets by the hundreds of thousands. The Europeans are responding to different pressure. Most of the European public wants to see a ceasefire and they want to see a diplomatic solution. They understand that the two-state solution has been killed primarily by the Israelis, but also with the support of the United States. Hamas also doesn't want to see a two-state solution because it doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. So what we need is diplomacy. We need the thinking of people like Guterres, the leader of the United Nations, and the diplomats on both sides. The fact that so many European countries were represented in Cairo, knowing that this was going to be a peace summit, and that the Arab response was going to be to call for an immediate ceasefire. The fact that they participated, I think, is a positive sign. But clearly, it's not enough yet. And it looks increasingly like the Israelis are about to launch that invasion. If that happens, all bets are off. We are really in a serious, serious crisis, a global crisis, if that happens.
Sure. And while that crisis continues, there's also the humanitarian crisis, the deepening humanitarian crisis that is resulting.
For example, they're making a big deal of the fact that 20 trucks are getting in. Well, before October 7th, there were approximately 400 trucks getting in every day. And even that was not sufficient to meet the Palestinian needs. About 80% of Palestinians were living in poverty then, and about 46% of Palestinians in Gaza were unemployed. So it was already a humanitarian catastrophe. And now they're letting in this small symbolic number that's going to make very, very little difference. and they're not letting in the energy supplies that are so badly needed to prop up a healthcare system that's collapsing. So we're not doing nearly enough, but 800 EU officials have just issued a statement condemning the European Union for not taking a stronger stance and for going along with this U.S.-Israel, effectively giving Israel a blank check and giving them the green light. So there is a lot of opposition, which is part of why the Europeans participated. There's also growing sentiment in the U.S. Congress by the progressives and by some of the right-wing Republicans that this is not encouraging Netanyahu, even though Biden is trying to put some constraints upon what the Israelis are doing. He's going along saying that it's up to Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, Israel certainly has the right to defend itself, but going into Gaza the way it is, recognizing what a horrific massacre that Hamas did against the Israeli civilians and kids at that dance party. I mean, this is outrageous. But to cause thousands and tens of thousands of civilian deaths in Gaza in retaliation is not the response that anybody wants to see. The estimate is that perhaps as many as 2,000 Gazan children have already been killed in the U.S. bombing. Over 4,000 Gazan deaths already. And this is the tip of the iceberg for what we're going to see if Israel invades.
Sure, and Hamas has recently released 2 American hostages, while Israel labels that as a propaganda. Now, what do you make of this? I mean, what happens next, and what happens to the hostage situation?
I think that what Hamas would like to see happen is to provoke an Israeli invasion. Just like Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants were thrilled when the U.S. responded by first invading Afghanistan and then invading Iraq after 9/11. I think that the Gazans, at least Hamas, would love to see that kind of response. I don't think they've shown much concern for the life of people in Gaza over the last 15, 17 years, 18 years. However, Israel should welcome everybody who Hamas is willing to release. Yes, it's propaganda on Hamas's part, but they're talking about a large-scale release of hostages, and that would be a wonderful thing if that occurs, if Hamas releases all the hostages, and Israel might have to, in return, release the 5,000 or so Palestinian prisoners that it holds. Well, that would be a step in the right direction and diffusing tensions. From the Hamas's perspective, the bloodshed is welcome for propaganda. From the global perspective, anything that can be done to ease this crisis is in the interest of the rest of the planet.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Kuznick, for joining us and giving us your time and all those insights. Thank you.
Thank you.